I initiated the divorce from my husband while facing hundreds of millions in debt. It wasn't because the love was gone, but because it was the only way to save our entire portfolio of assets. I transferred all the properties, the stock, the money into his name while I took on every dollar of debt. The plan was perfect until the day my gentle, unassuming husband disappeared along with every last document. Only then did I understand that in this game I was the one being hunted, not him. The signing of the papers happened so fast it felt like I was an outsider watching a pre-staged scene. The mediation room at the courthouse was clean, sterile, with nothing out of place. On the table were two thin folders lying parallel like two lines that would never meet. The clerk turned the pages, a steady rustling sound. No one asked any questions. I signed first, my stroke neat, decisive, without a tremor. I'd signed too many documents in my life: contracts, guarantees, transfer deeds. This signature carried no special emotional weight. It was just a procedure. Ethan signed after me, pausing for half a beat as was his habit, then placed the pen on the exact spot that had been marked. Done. The notary's seal came down dry and heavy. An ending. Leaving the room, we walked side by side for a short distance, not touching. No goodbyes were necessary. I looked straight ahead. Ethan looked down at his phone, typed a quick message, then put it away. The automatic glass doors slid open, and the light flooded in. From that moment, legally, we were strangers. In the car, I called my personal attorney and said only one thing: it's done. The voice on the other end replied, I've received the scans. The next steps will proceed as planned. I hung up, my heart rate returning to normal. I hated moments when I couldn't control time, and that signing had gone by too quickly. But fast was good. Fast meant clean, and clean meant less risk. To the outside world, everyone thought I was the one in charge. That image had followed me for 10 years. At every party, people turned to me when talking about money, and to Ethan when talking about aesthetics. Ethan was an architect, urbane, gracious, never one to hog the spotlight. A husband, just prominent enough not to be dismissed, just reserved enough not to be grating. I found that balance convenient. It gave me total authority. The only problem is authority doesn't always equal security. Our penthouse apartment overlooked the Hudson, glittering every night. I stood before the glass wall, opening the master file on my tablet. The numbers appeared like a tangled map. Project A not fully permitted. Project B credit lines tightening. Project C bogged down in eminent domain disputes. The cash flow was a carousel, short-term loans feeding long-term ambitions. On paper, everything was still moving. Out there, the market winds were shifting. I don't remember the exact moment I crossed the line between growth and leverage. Maybe it was after a meeting Ethan had introduced me to. A tidy dinner, right place, right people. The man across the table spoke little, smiled thinly, and presented a few numbers just beautiful enough. Opportunity doesn't wait long, he'd said. Ethan doesn't push, he'd remarked. He just told a story on the side about a building once criticized as risky that later became an icon. I listened. I was used to listening and choosing. In the months that followed, I got used to the fast-paced signing, pivoting, believing I was leading the pack. Every time I hesitated, Ethan would say very softly, "You deserve to be above them." It wasn't a command, just an affirmation. I liked that kind of affirmation: no demands, no strings. When the credit started to tighten, I still had a few outs: sell off some assets, roll over debt, extend timelines. But the market doesn't care about persistence, it only cares about liquidity. One morning the bank called, the voice so polite it was robotic. "We need you to post additional collateral, Miss Vance." I didn't panic. Panic is for people unaccustomed to responsibility. I opened the plan I prepared long ago, the final option I had once set aside. Restructure the family assets and uncontested divorce, transfer everything by the book. On paper, it was clean. I didn't call it running, I called it reorganizing. When I told Ethan, he was silent for a long time. Not a dramatic silence, just a contemplative one. "Are you sure?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm just worried," he said. I laughed. Later, when this is all over. Ethan didn't say more. He only reminded me of one small thing: everything had to be by the book. We did it by the book. The assets weren't transferred all at once. The house first, then the equity, then the cash deposits. Each step was notarized, appraised, taxed. 1, 2, I started to feel lighter. That lightness wasn't happiness. It was like taking off heavy armor after a long day. I started sleeping more deeply. The divorce signing was just a period at the end of a sentence, the end of a chapter I believed I had navigated with a clear head. I believed in the paperwork, in the process, in my ability to calculate. I believed that all risks could be quantified. That evening, Ethan texted, going out of town for a few days on business. I read it and nodded. Business trips were normal. I didn't ask more. People who work with time don't ask superfluous questions. The next morning, I called the notary's office to confirm the final transfer. The secretary replied professionally, "The file has been completed." I hung up. Standing in the middle of the vast apartment, I suddenly realized the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Nothing was wrong, nothing was out of the ordinary, it was just quieter than necessary. I opened my phone and scrolled through recent calls. Ethan's name was there with no new notifications. I put the phone down and went to make coffee. In my head, I replayed every step. Everything was correct, so correct there was no room for emotion to squeeze in. I didn't know that somewhere a file had been neatly compiled years ago, not for immediate use, just waiting for the right moment. The following days passed with a rhythm so steady I almost believed I had passed the hardest part. I woke up early, made coffee, opened my calendar. The meetings were shorter, the calls fewer. The cash flow was monitored hourly, but it no longer created noise in my head. I reminded myself this was a waiting period, waiting for the market to breathe, for the paperwork to complete its cycle, for the due dates to be handled according to plan. At social gatherings, people still called me by the familiar name Elena. Still, that respectful gaze, still those roundabout questions about prospects. I answered just enough, not boasting, not complaining. A businessperson shouldn't reveal their state before the numbers speak for themselves. The apartment felt larger with only one person. I started clearing things out. Not to erase memories, I wasn't in the habit of nostalgia, but to reduce noise. Objects that didn't serve a purpose should go. I repositioned my desk, changed the angle of a chair. Small changes helped me maintain a sense of control. Ethan communicated less. Short professional texts arrived. Meetings over, heading back late. I replied with a preset thumbs up emoji. The silence between us wasn't a void, it was a tacit agreement. Each of us doing our part. That afternoon, I met with my lawyer to go over the list of creditors. Name after name, number after number. Some could be negotiated, some needed time. If everything goes according to schedule, he said, you'll get through this. I nodded. I was used to conditional statements. Business is a collection of if-then propositions. That evening, I got a call from the bank, not to push, just an update. The voice was still polite, still emotionless. I thanked them and hung up. No new information meant no new developments. No new developments meant temporary safety. I asked myself if I had ever suspected Ethan. The answer was yes, but not in the way people might think. My suspicion wasn't aimed at his motives, but at the tightness of the process. I had checked everything. The transfer schedules, the taxes, the notarizations. I trusted things with stamps and signatures. People, no. But documents, yes. And our documents were clean. That night I opened old files, the first decisions that led me here. A project introduced as reasonable leverage, a signing where I convinced myself the risk was diversified. Ethan was present in many of those meetings, not as a decision maker. He stood by listening, sometimes adding a detail about the design, about the vision, details that made the picture look bigger than it was. I remembered one evening after leaving a restaurant on the Upper East Side, Ethan said, "Don't stop at safe." Elena. Safety doesn't get people to the position they deserve. I smiled then. I was used to being spurred on by phrases like that. Nothing suspicious, just synergy. The next day I went to the notary's office to get backup copies. The waiting room was cool, the sound of the printer steady. The clerk handed me the stack of papers with a faint smile. I flipped through each page, each seal. There was nothing to find fault with. A sense of reassurance returned, slow but sure. On the way back I stopped at a quiet cafe. I wasn't meeting anyone, just sitting alone. Watching people pass by, I realized I'd grown accustomed to not sharing. Sharing is a form of risk. I don't invest in unnecessary risks. Late afternoon, Ethan called. "I'll be back later than expected." I asked curtly, "How long?" "Not sure yet." I replied, "Okay." No more words. We had long ago established our way of talking, enough information, no emotion. That night I slept deeply, dreamlessly. When I woke up, light was already flooding the room. I made coffee, opened my calendar. A meeting had been rescheduled, an email requested additional documentation, small things manageable. I called Ethan to confirm the schedule for the final transfer signing, even though I already knew the answer. Later he'd said, the call rang longer than usual. No one picked up. I put the phone down and continued my work. A single missed call meant nothing. In the afternoon, I received an email from the law office. The subject line was neutral. The content was brief: "We have completed all steps as directed. We will inform you of any new developments." I replied, "Received." As the sun set, the apartment sank back into silence. I stood at the window looking at the ribbons of light below. The city operated like a machine. I like to think of it that way: no emotion, no favoritism, only rules. I texted Ethan a single line: "Everything's fine." The message was sent, no delivered receipt. I waited a few minutes, then put the phone down. Waiting wasn't my habit, but I understood some silences needed to be left alone. Near midnight, I opened my phone again. Still no response. I wasn't worried. I don't allow myself to worry without data. I jotted down a few tasks for tomorrow. Turned off the light. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The silence no longer felt neutral. It felt heavy. I called Ethan. This time the call didn't connect. I called again. Same thing. I texted, "Are you okay?" The message sent no read receipt. I didn't jump to conclusions. I hate baseless conclusions. I called his assistant. No answer. I called a mutual business partner. They said Ethan had left a meeting early the day before. I thanked them. Hung up. In my head, a list opened up. Not a list of emotions, but of possibilities. No signal, busy, technical trouble. I eliminated them one by one. As the list shortened, I allowed myself to stand up. I called the notary's office again. "I need to confirm the status of a file," I said. The voice on the other end was still professional. The file was completed as per regulations. I asked one more question: "Did anyone request a copy recently?" A short pause. "Someone with a legal power of attorney did." I asked for the name. They told me. I stood still for a few seconds, not long enough to be called shocked, just long enough to understand that a variable had left my spreadsheet. I thanked them, hung up. The apartment was silent. The hum of the AC was suddenly louder. I didn't call anyone else. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, accessed the cloud drive. The familiar files appeared. I reviewed every timeline, no gaps, no missteps. Everything was correct. It was just that some things that are formally correct can be sequentially wrong. I looked at the screen where the numbers still lay dormant. For the first time in years, I felt like I was facing a void that couldn't be quantified. Not fear, not panic, just a data deficit. And I hate data deficits. I didn't call Ethan again. When the data doesn't answer, calling more just creates noise. I changed my clothes, went down to the garage, and drove straight to the office. The city morning began like any other. Horn slanting sunlight, hurried faces. No one knew that in my head a variable had just broken orbit. At the office, I closed the door and opened the master spreadsheet. The timeline ran from left to right, each milestone marked with a confirmation stamp. I rechecked the order of transfers, the notarization dates, the tax filing dates. No errors, no extra steps. Correct things usually bring a sense of security. Today they brought a sense of exposure. I called my lawyer. No beating around the bush. "Check something for me," I said. "Has anyone changed the legal status of the transferred assets?" The other end was quiet while he typed. "No," he replied. "Formally everything is as it was." I thanked him, hung up. Formally. I repeated that word in my head. Formality was what I had trusted for years. Near noon, an unknown number appeared on my phone. I answered. A neutral male voice, no greeting. "Is this Miss Vance?" I said it was. "I am legal counsel representing Mr. Ethan Cole," he said slowly, clearly, as if reading an internal memo. "Mr. Cole requests that all communication from today forward go through our office." I didn't ask why. I asked, "What scope of communication?" The other end replied immediately. "Regarding the transferred assets and any resulting legal requirements." I nodded, though I knew he couldn't see. "Send it in writing," I said. "Everything in writing." He agreed. The call ended. I sat still for a few seconds, not to collect myself but to file the event in the right mental cabinet. The email arrived 10 minutes later. The content was short, emotionless. A confirmation of representation, a request for all contact to be directed to the law firm with a list of documents attached for reference when needed. I opened the first file. Scans of old emails, text messages, meeting notes, calendar entries. Each a small piece pieced together into a picture that was all too familiar. The words were my own, the proposals were my own. I didn't read to the end. I understood enough to know that reading more wouldn't change the outcome. I called my lawyer again. This time I forwarded him the email. Take a look at this for me, I said. Risk assessment. He was quiet for much longer. When he spoke, his voice was low. You shouldn't sue, he said. At least not right now. I asked why. He answered, with a short sentence, because this file is enough to change the narrative. Change the narrative, I nodded. I'd heard that phrase in many different contexts. It always meant a loss of control. I didn't ask further. I didn't need a long analysis. I knew when to stop. So the next step I asked. Wait, he said. And don't create any more data. I hung up. Outside the glass wall, the sky was changing color. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since morning. My body was reacting slower than usual. I stood up, poured a glass of water, took a small sip. It had no distinct taste. In the afternoon, I received another email, this time a calendar invitation for a preliminary discussion at their law office. Not a court date, not mediation. Just a discussion. I accepted the invitation. When your options narrow, refusal is no longer a form of power. Before the meeting, I reviewed the early years, the times Ethan stood beside me in meetings, not deciding, not objecting, just adding detail, setting the scene. I remembered the sense of security I felt having someone who wasn't competing for the spotlight. I had mistaken that for respect. Perhaps I was wrong. Their law office was in a quiet building on Park Avenue. Minimalist decor, chairs spaced just far enough apart. Ethan's lawyer arrived first, stood up to greet me. Ethan wasn't there. I didn't ask. His presence or absence didn't change the structure of the meeting. We are here to clarify a few points, the lawyer said. First of all, Mr. Cole has no intention of causing difficulty. I looked at him. Intentions are not data, I replied. He nodded. No reaction. He placed a binder on the table. Should you intend to petition the court to void the executed transfers, he said, we will be forced to submit these accompanying documents to protect our client. I didn't open the binder. I asked the result. He answered directly, it will be pursued under a different legal theory. I understood. I stood up. Send your proposal in writing, I said. Everything else can wait. He didn't try to keep me. Leaving the building, I took a deep breath. Not to calm myself, just to mark a new milestone. The milestone from which every move would have to account for one more variable. That night I didn't go back to the old apartment. I went to a hotel near my office, checked into a standard room. I needed a neutral space, no memories, no excess furniture. I put my laptop on the desk, opened a new file. Title: Contingencies. A list appeared. Litigation rolled out. Negotiation: insufficient leverage. Waiting: costly. I kept writing each line, a possibility complete with costs, risks, probabilities. I didn't allow myself to use emotional words. Emotions don't help when you need to restructure your position. Near midnight, I got a news alert on my phone. A tycoon had passed away. A short neutral report. I skimmed it, about to close it. A small detail caught my eye. A name. A connection. I opened a few more sources, old articles, photos. A line started to form, incomplete, but enough to raise a question. I sat still, staring at the screen. A new variable had appeared, one that wasn't on my original spreadsheet. I didn't jump to a conclusion. I made a note, marked it with an asterisk. Asterisks are usually where it's worth going back. The next morning I called an acquaintance in the legal world. I didn't ask directly. I asked about probate procedures when there are related disputed assets. He gave me the textbook answer. I thanked him. I said no more. I closed my laptop. In my mind, a new structure began to form. Not a plan. Not yet. Just a direction. I didn't need a quick win. I needed to maintain equilibrium long enough for the other side to reveal the point they didn't want revealed. I looked at the clock. There wasn't much time, but there was enough. And for the first time since signing those papers, I allowed myself one very short thought. This game isn't over. I started with things that had no emotional name: lists, procedures, conditions. When the game turns legal, every assumption must be backed by evidence. I put my coffee cup next to my laptop, opened the statutes related to estate law. Not to find a loophole, but to identify the stopgaps. A person involved in a property dispute, even if not yet indicted, could have related proceedings temporarily stayed. A stay isn't a conclusion, but a stay is enough to slow down a machine accustomed to running fast. I made a note, added another asterisk. No hasty conclusions. I called my lawyer. I didn't lay out the whole theory. If a person is about to receive a large inheritance and a related property dispute emerges, what happens? He gave the textbook answer. It can be paused for verification. I asked one more question. What's the threshold? He paused for a beat. Doesn't have to be criminal, he said. Just enough grounds for an inquiry. Enough grounds. I was familiar with words like that. They aren't judgmental, they're technical. I didn't ask myself if I should do it. That question was no longer relevant. I asked myself how I could create enough grounds without pushing myself into a different corner. Balance was the goal, not victory. I scheduled a meeting with someone who had handled complex estate cases, not mentioning names or circumstances. I only asked about the process. He spoke slowly, carefully. Everything depends on the legal status of the related assets, he said. When the status is unclear, we pause. I added another line to my notes status. That afternoon, I returned to my lawyer's office. Not to counterattack, but to organize. I need a supplementary declaration, I said. Not a confession, I emphasized, just a clarification of the technical inconsistencies in the transfer documents. The lawyer looked at me. You know what that means, he asked. I know, I replied. And I accept the scope. Scope was something I could control. I chose small details, things that wouldn't decide the whole case but were enough to force the other side to verify. A date that didn't match between two documents. A valuation method that differed between 2 points in time. A signature on a power of attorney that appeared later than a logical milestone. Not errors, just discrepancies. We're not drawing conclusions, I said. We're just asking questions. The lawyer nodded. He understood how to ask the right questions at the right time. That evening I received an email from Ethan's side. Not from him, from his lawyer. An offer to talk in good faith. I read it but didn't reply immediately. Good faith is an ambiguous term. I prefer words that can be measured. I went to bed early, not because I was tired, but because tomorrow needed a clear head. When I woke up I checked my phone. No personal messages, only my calendar. I kept this habit, not letting the day begin with a reaction. The declaration was sent before noon. Neutral language, no emotion, no full admission of fault, just pointing out areas that required verification to ensure the transparency of the file. I read it 3 times. Cold enough, clean enough. In the afternoon, Ethan's lawyer called. We've received it, he said. You're opening an unnecessary line of inquiry. I replied, I'm clarifying my own file. He was silent. Silence is a form of data. That night, I sat in my hotel room, turned on the news. A brief mention of an estate asset verification, no names mentioned, just a procedural announcement. I turned off the TV. I didn't need to see more. The next morning I received a call from another new number. This time, the voice was lower. Miss Vance, the person said. We need to talk directly. I asked about what. About a quick resolution, he replied. Quick resolutions usually come with concessions. I scheduled a meeting, not rushing. I chose a time slot I could control. The meeting took place in a small conference room. No Ethan, just his representatives. They talked about risk, I talked about time. They talked about good faith, I talked about legal status. The conversation never raised in volume, it didn't need to. What do you want? They asked. I answered with one sentence. I want my record clean, and I want the verification to end. They looked at each other. I knew they understood what that meant. In return, they asked. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do its work. In return, I said I will withdraw the requests for clarification after my obligations are settled. Obligations. Not money, not honor. I chose that word because it evoked no emotion. The meeting ended quickly. No handshake. Not necessary. We had said enough. On the way back I received a text from Ethan, the first direct one. We need to talk. I read it, didn't reply. Talking was no longer the tool. Documents were the tool. That evening I received a draft settlement. I read it slowly, every line, every clause. No surprises. Everything revolved around returning what had been transferred in exchange for stopping the verification. Balance was re-established in the way of people who don't want to be in the spotlight. I sent back my edits. Short, clear, no extra words. They responded within an hour. Agreed to most. I agreed to the rest. We set a schedule for execution. That night I sat alone looking at the city. There was no feeling of victory, just the feeling of completing a cycle. I knew I would be back at zero. But zero, if it's clean, is still a place to stand. The next morning I went to the notary's office. Cold space, the rustle of paper, the thud of a stamp. I signed without trembling. I was used to signing things that ended. When I left, I didn't look back. No need. What needed to be kept was kept. What needed to be returned was returned. I stepped outside, took a short breath. The game had no winner, only people who knew when to stop. I moved from negotiation to execution. The space between these two states is often where mistakes happen, so I kept everything to a minimum. The to-do list was reduced to irreversible milestones: transfer schedule, bank confirmation, notarization, taxes. None of it required emotion. I met my lawyer in the morning. We went over each clause in the final draft. No, if only when. When the assets return. When the obligations are cleared. When the verification request is withdrawn. I demanded specific deadlines for each step. The lawyer nodded. He understood that ambiguity is the enemy of security. At noon I had a simple meal. No calls, no news. I needed a clear head to identify the smallest risks. Big risks usually have names, small ones don't. The first asset to be returned was the house. I arrived at the notary's office 10 minutes early. The room was still as cool as ever. The clerk handed me the papers. I read them slowly. The familiar words appeared in their old places, but their meaning was different. I signed. The seal came down. A circle closed. After the house came the equity. This took more time. Back and forth confirmations, short emails, calls that were just me saying, received. I tracked every notification. When there was a delay, I didn't push. I asked for the reason. Asking the right question helps others fix things faster than being pressured. By afternoon, the bank confirmed the first wire transfer had hit the account. Not the full amount, just the beginning. I didn't celebrate. I noted it. Noting was enough. While waiting for the next milestones, I dealt with the list of creditors, names I knew by heart. I called each one. I didn't beg. I informed them the obligation will be settled on this schedule. My voice was even with no excess promises. The person on the other end would pause for a few seconds, then confirm. When information is clear, tension naturally decreases. That evening I got a text from Ethan. Not long. I've signed. I read it, didn't reply. One-way information was sufficient. An emotional exchange now would only add friction. The next morning I was at the bank early. The manager I knew came out to shake my hand. I didn't take it. I nodded. We sat down. He read his report, said the things required by procedure. I listened. When he stopped, I asked, when will it be complete? He answered with a date and time. I wrote it down. At noon, I received a notification from Ethan's lawyer. The verification requests would be withdrawn immediately after the final payment milestone was met. I replied, noted. Nothing more. I went for a short walk. Not to relax, but because I needed a change of scenery to check my body's reaction. When pressure decreases, the body often responds more slowly. I realized I wasn't as tense as the days before. Not relieved, just not tense. By the afternoon, the second wire came through. This time the majority. I opened my spreadsheet. The cells turned from red to yellow, then green. Color is the fastest way for the brain to understand progress. I like things I can see. The last call of the day came from my lawyer. If everything proceeds on schedule, he said, you'll be clean. I asked for his definition of clean. He replied, no outstanding obligations, no pending verification requests. I nodded. That was a definition I could accept. I stayed late at the office that night. Not because there was a lot of work, but because I wanted to be in a neutral space. When the final milestone arrived, I opened the window. A light breeze blew in. The city below was still bright. I didn't think about the past. I thought about not having to think anymore. The next morning, I went to the notary's office one last time. It was quicker this time. Fewer papers. The seal came down with a familiar thud. I signed my name without looking. As I stood up, I felt like I had just put down a heavy weight. I left first, not waiting for anyone. In the parking garage, I received the notification from the bank. The obligation had been paid in full. I read it twice, not out of doubt, but out of habit. I sent a short email to Ethan's lawyer, completed. He replied in minutes, we will withdraw the request. I archived the email, closed it. At noon I ate a very ordinary meal. It had no remarkable taste. I realized I wasn't hungry, not full. My body was in a state of equilibrium. In the afternoon, I cleared my desk. Not clearing to leave, clearing to make it empty. I put the completed files into a cabinet. I didn't need to see them anymore. What's done should be put away. As evening fell, I stood at the window. This time I didn't open a file, I didn't check my phone. I let the lights below do their own work. I thought about the number 0. Not as a loss, but as a clean starting point. My phone vibrated. A call. I saw Ethan's name. I didn't answer. I placed the phone face down on the table. Not out of anger, but because this call no longer had a purpose. I poured some water, took a small sip. It was tasteless. I liked that. Tasteless meant no emotional interference. I went to sleep early dreamlessly. When I woke up, light was in the room. I made coffee, opened my calendar. No more appointments related to the old story. Only new tasks yet to be named. I stood for a moment looking at the blank calendar. Blank wasn't scary. Blank is a space where you can put something else if you need to. After all obligations were settled, the hardest part wasn't the lack of money but the lack of noise. I was used to days bent out of shape by schedules, by numbers, by calls that came without warning. When it all stopped, the silence emerged like a physical void measurable in time. I moved out of the old apartment one morning without hiring movers. I didn't take much: basic clothes, a laptop, a few notebooks. The things once considered expensive suddenly seemed cumbersome. I left them behind not out of generosity but because they no longer had a function. The rental was small near the office with enough light and neutral furniture. I liked places that didn't force their inhabitants to remember. I put my desk by the window, the chair with its back to the wall. No decorations needed, no pictures. The first day in the new place I opened a blank file. I didn't give it a title. I was used to naming everything but not this time. I let the cursor blink. Blinking is a kind of reminder you can write or you cannot. The phone was silent. No more texts from lawyers, no more updates from the bank. The absence of notifications was a new kind of data. I noted it. At noon I walked outside to eat, a small diner where no one knew who I was. I ordered something simple. While waiting I watched how other people talked. Their stories had no objective. I realized it had been a long time since I'd been in a space like that where words didn't need to lead to a decision. In the afternoon I returned to the office. A few old partners texted to check in. I replied briefly. I'm fine. No explanations, no stories. When a chapter ends, retelling it often blurs the boundary. That evening, I received an email from the other family's estate. Not from Ethan. The language was polite, the salutation distant. They informed me of the completion of the probate process. My name wasn't mentioned. I read it, closed it. I had no role in that document and I didn't need one. I thought about Ethan not often but enough to recognize the change. Before I thought of him as a variable to be controlled. Now he was just a data point that had left the system. A data point that leaves the system no longer has influence. The next day I went to my old office building. I didn't go up. I stood in the lobby and looked at the directory. A few familiar names, a few new ones. Time doesn't ask for permission to continue. I left after 5 minutes, long enough to confirm that I didn't need to go back. In the afternoon I met with my lawyer one last time for this file. Not for work but for closure. He handed me a short confirmation letter. No loose ends. I've signed, it said. Another signature. This one was lighter. What will you do next? He asked. I didn't answer right away. That question used to have a ready answer. Now it didn't. I haven't decided, I said. He nodded, didn't press. That night I went back to the rental. I opened the window. The wind carried the smell of the street. I realized I no longer needed to check my phone before bed. Old habits dissolve slowly but surely. The next morning I woke up early. Not because of a schedule but because of the light. I made coffee, sat down at my desk. I wrote a few lines, not a plan, not a strategy, just a record of things done, things not done. I didn't use the words right or wrong. I used the words it happened. Around noon, a call came. A familiar number. Ethan. I stared at the screen for a few seconds. I didn't answer, not out of resentment but because this call carried no new data. I let the phone vibrate until it went silent. In the afternoon, I went out and bought a few small things. A good pen, a plain notebook. I chose them carefully not for the price, but for the feel in my hand. These things would be with me for a while. They needed to be reliable. That night I received a text from an old partner. "If you want to start again, I have a proposal." I read it but didn't reply immediately. I let it sit there an unopened option. Before sleeping, I stood in front of the mirror. I wasn't looking for signs of fatigue, I was looking for familiarity. This face had been through many phases. It would go on. I turned off the light, didn't set an alarm. Tomorrow had no milestones that needed marking. I found that not scary. It was just a blank space. A blank space, if it's clean, is a good place to start. Or to stop. It depends on the person. I didn't rush to start again. When you're used to operating at high speed, deceleration requires discipline. I gave myself a time frame, no decisions, no new projects, no signing anything beyond the bare minimum. I called it the observation phase. Observing the market, observing people, observing myself, when there was no longer the pressure to prove anything. In the mornings I walked more. No headphones, no calls. Just the rhythm of my steps and the sounds not aimed at me. I realized the city had layers of sound I had previously ignored. They didn't carry information, but they carried a rhythm. I met a few old acquaintances for social coffees. No talk of money, no talk of opportunities. I listened to them talk about what was hot. I didn't argue, I just noted how they used words, how they dodged questions, how they set expectations. The market isn't just in the charts, it's in the language. One afternoon, a thin envelope arrived at my rental. No return address. Inside was a notarized copy of a document confirming the completion of Ethan's inheritance proceedings. My signature wasn't on it. It wasn't needed. I read it quickly, put it down. This had been outside my scope for a long time, but its arrival felt like a form of closure. I didn't make contact. I didn't respond. When a straight line has turned, trying to pull it back only creates more sharp angles. That afternoon I opened the new plain notebook. I didn't write a plan, I wrote principles. Not for framing on a wall, but for use. Principles about leverage, principles about time, principles about silence. I crossed out a few things I once believed were true, kept the things that had proven their value in the hardest times. One principle I wrote more slowly: never place the entire structure of your security in the hands of another person, no matter what position they hold. I didn't write a name. I didn't need to. In the evening I got a call from my old lawyer. Not about a case file. "There's a small seminar on corporate restructuring," he said. "Interested in attending?" I asked. "In what capacity?" he replied. As someone who's been through it, I agreed. Not for the reputation, but for the perspective. The seminar was concise. Familiar presentations, polite questions. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell a story. I just talked about process. About how when everything falls apart, the thing that keeps you standing isn't money, but the ability to read the documents and take responsibility. I finished and sat down. No loud applause, but a few understanding looks. Afterward, a young person came up and asked for advice. I said simply, "Don't trust prolonged smoothness. It's usually a sign of a structure that hasn't been tested." He nodded. I said no more. On the way home, I realized I no longer avoided these kinds of gatherings, not because I wanted to be a storyteller, but because I had stepped out of the role of someone running to someone else's rhythm. When your own rhythm is stable, being in a crowd no longer costs energy. Late one night, I received a text from Ethan. No call, just a single line. "I know you won't reply, but I wanted to say I did what had to be done." I read it. I didn't reply. That sentence didn't ask for a response. It just needed to be sent. I turned off the screen. I didn't analyze the words. No need. People who choose to operate through documents usually understand the value of final silence. The next morning, I got an email from the old partner about the proposal he'd sent earlier. I opened it. A small project, manageable risk, no high leverage. I didn't reply immediately. I called them. Not to negotiate, but to ask how they handled worst-case scenarios. Their answer satisfied me. I scheduled a trial work session. No contract. Just a trial. I wanted to see how a new structure operated without pressure. If it holds up in a low state, it can stand when it's high. In the afternoon, I passed by a different notary's office. I didn't go in, I just stood looking for a few seconds. The same glass doors, the same thud of stamps. I realized I no longer felt a weight when thinking about these places. They had returned to their proper function: tools, not symbols. That night I cooked dinner. A simple dish. I ate slowly. I didn't turn on the news. I no longer needed updates to exist. The market was still there. I would need it when I needed to. Before sleeping, I opened my notebook and added one more line to the list of principles. When a game ends with no winner, the important thing is not to try and turn it into a victory through storytelling. I underlined it, put the pen down. Tomorrow I would start again, but not in the old way. Not in a hurry, not with noise, not betting on smoothness. And if there was one thing I was sure of, it was that durable structures don't need to prove themselves with loud noises. They exist by not collapsing when the silence is long. I started working again in the most minimal way possible. No big office, no sign on the door. One desk, a concise calendar, a list of projects with a risk ceiling. I chose my work based on how people answered the worst-case scenario question, not the best-case scenario vision. The trial work session was short. I didn't talk much about vision. I asked about failure scenarios. They gave me numbers, timelines, exit strategies. No beating around the bush. I nodded. Enough. In the following days, I maintained a low tempo. Every decision had a mandatory waiting period. I set a rule: no signing on the first day of hearing a proposal, no immediate response after a meeting. The pause is part of the safety. I paid a price to learn that, so I didn't begrudge it. One morning, I received an invitation to a press event. Ethan's name appeared at the bottom of the page. A position of honor. I didn't delete the email, nor did I go. Both appearing and not appearing could be interpreted. I chose not to create data. I ran into a few people I used to sit at tables with. They talked about the turnaround as an industry story. I didn't correct them, didn't confirm. When a story is told enough times, it loses its sharp edges on its own. The truth doesn't need to participate. At noon I sat at a new favorite cafe. I read a document without looking around. Someone asked to borrow a chair. I nodded. Small interactions that didn't require a performance. I liked that. That evening I received a short email from Ethan's lawyer. A notification of the final withdrawal of all verification requests. No well wishes attached. Not needed. I filed it in the closed folder. Everything had come full circle. I opened my notebook again to the list of principles. I added one more line: when both sides get to keep the part they needed most, leaving requires no ceremony. I didn't underline this one. It stood on its own. The next day, I signed the first contract since the incident. A small contract, clear exit clauses. No high leverage. I signed slowly. When I put the pen down, I didn't feel a rush. I took that as a good sign. In the afternoon, I walked past the courthouse unintentionally. I paused for a few seconds. People coming and going, security guards, waiting benches. These places used to be the line between having and losing. Now they were just public spaces. I walked away. A call came from an unknown number. I answered, a familiar voice. Ethan. No preamble. I know you don't want a long conversation, he said. I just wanted to say one thing. I didn't respond. What happened, he continued, it wasn't because I hate you. I was silent. It was just because I couldn't do it any other way. I heard him out, then hung up. No goodbye, no response. I didn't analyze the call. Analysis now would only create an echo. Echoes don't help with moving forward. That night I did something simple. I reorganized my file cabinet. I threw out unnecessary copies, kept what had educational value. Old papers become thin when put in their proper place. I locked the cabinet. Done. The next morning I met with my small team. We discussed how to measure risk. We didn't talk about profit first. I asked them to describe how they would deliver bad news. The one who delivers bad news the slowest is the biggest risk, I said. I watched their reactions. They understood. Late one evening, I turned on the TV. A brief news item mentioned the restructuring of a major corporation, no direct connection to me. I turned it off. The news was no longer a measure of my mood. I wrote a few more lines in my notebook. Silence is not an escape, it is an option when all necessary information is already present. I closed the notebook. The days passed without a climax. I realized I had traveled very far from the place where I used to need climaxes to feel I existed. Steadiness was the new measure. I stood at the window at night looking at the lights. I didn't think about the distant future. I thought about what tomorrow would begin with. A small meeting, a small decision, a small signature. Small things, if they are durable, accumulate. I put my phone down, turned off the light. There was nothing left to wait for. When you don't need to wait, sleep comes faster. And in that quiet darkness, I knew I had left the old game, not carrying victory or defeat, only the ability to stand firm when everything went silent. I went to the courthouse on a morning with no rain. Not for a hearing of my own, but because I had to sign something at the notary public's office located in the same complex. I walked through the lobby where light reflected off the polished stone floor in even patches. People came and went without looking at each other for long. Everyone here had their own business. As I stepped into the notary's office, I saw Ethan. He was at the other counter, his back to me. Well-fitting suit jacket, straight posture. Nothing different from the image I was used to except for the distance. We hadn't arranged this. The coincidence held no meaning. I finished my signing, put my pen away, and turned to leave. Ethan turned around at the same moment. Our eyes met for a beat, just short enough that we didn't need to look away. No surprise, no tension. Just recognition. I gave a slight nod. He nodded back. No one spoke. We both walked out into the lobby, not side by side, not entirely separate. Just two paths that intersected and then continued on their own momentum. At the door, Ethan stopped first. I stopped a step behind him. He said something very quiet, just loud enough for me to hear. "It's all done." I replied with a sentence no louder. Yes. No questions, no explanations. We had already used up all the necessary language. Any words spoken now would only be opening what was already clear. Outside, the wind was light. I stood still for a few seconds, not to watch him go, just to adjust my breathing. Ethan walked toward the parking lot. I walked in the opposite direction. I didn't need to look back to know that we would have no more reason to meet again. At noon I had a simple lunch. I didn't think about the encounter. It had been filed away in the right cabinet, an event that required no further processing. I read a few documents, jotted down some notes. Work returned to its normal rhythm, a rhythm I had chosen for myself. In the afternoon, I received a final confirmation email from the bank. The file had been archived. I replied, "Received." I didn't save a printed copy. Things that are finished should be kept in a place you don't need to reopen. I went home to my rental that evening. I opened the window. The lights below came on in strips. The city didn't change because of my story. I found that comforting. Large structures don't care about personal feelings, and because of that they are fair in their own way. I opened my notebook, reread the principles I had written. I didn't add any new ones. I underlined a line that was already there. Don't try to find a winner in games where the initial goal was survival. I closed the notebook. My phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number with a short message. "Hope you're doing well." I could guess who sent it, but I didn't confirm. I didn't reply. Not out of coldness, but because a well-wish doesn't need a response to exist. The next morning I woke up early. No packed schedule, no urgent tasks. I made coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened the project file I was working on. I read slowly, not because I lacked confidence, but because I had time. Time was the greatest luxury I had managed to keep after everything. At midday I went out for a long walk. I noticed the small details: a new shop opened, an old sign, replaced, a restaurant closed. Everything moved in its own cycle. I was no longer standing outside that cycle. I was in it, but I wasn't letting it sweep me away. In the afternoon I signed another small contract. As I put the pen down, I remembered the old signatures, heavy, decisive, carrying pressure. This signature was light, not because the value was low, but because it was part of a structure I understood completely. That evening, I received a calendar notification for a meeting next week. I confirmed, turned off my computer. I didn't check anything else. The habit of constant checking had gradually faded. When a system is stable, constant checking only creates noise. Before sleeping, I stood in front of the mirror. I looked straight ahead. Not searching for traces of fatigue or victory. I was just confirming that I was still here in the way I had chosen. Enough. I turned off the light. In the darkness, I thought about something very simple. Money didn't make me stronger, nor did it make me weaker. It just forced me to see more clearly how I stood or fell when everything was stripped bare. Sleep came quickly, dreamlessly. When I woke up, the light filled the room evenly. A new day had begun without needing a declaration. And if anyone were to ask me later who won in that story, I wouldn't answer. Because I know the answer wouldn't help them understand anything more. The most important games don't end with a victory, but with each person leaving the table with the part they can be responsible for. Some marriages don't end because the love is gone, but because money forces people to show their true faces. When everything is laid on the scales, no one is a victim and no one is truly a winner. There are only those who walk away from the game with their share of responsibility. If you've ever seen money change a relationship, share this story with someone facing a difficult choice. Sometimes seeing clearly sooner is the only way not to lose everything.